Welcome back to Intro to Sociology. This lecture is on the color family ties out of wedlock, where we will be discussing the reading about family that is in your textbook. I think it's chapter 14, sections point 1, 14.1 to 14.3. So that is what we'll be talking about today, is the family and sociology of the family. With sociology, you have this overall context, right? Or this overall discipline of sociology that we talk about, that we talk through, that we look at everything from a sociological lens. And then once you have that, if you decide that you want to go into sociology, then you start to study specific institutions. And it's almost like when you're a doctor and you go to med school and you kind of have an overall idea about medicine, and then you decide that you want to practice a specific type of medicine, or you want to do your residency, and you may do it in pediatrics or emergency medicine or internal medicine or heart cardiology or surgery or whatever, right? So then you go into a specific type of medicine. Sociology is the same way, right? You have this overall discipline, and then your research goes into specific parts. So you have like sociology of the family, sociology of education, sociology of sports. I study race and class. You might have, well, a friend of mine studies the family, sociology of fatherhood. Another friend of mine is a medical sociologist. So she studies medical sociology, specifically Black maternal health, gender and sex, teen sexual identity, right? Just so many different perspectives that you can kind of specialize in, right? So just depends on, what you're interested in. So right now, I'm just going to kind of introduce you to some of those, right? So sociology of the family. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the media, criminal justice, criminology. Sometimes you can do just criminology. Sometimes you can do like the sociology of crime. So like studying crime from a kind of a sociological standpoint. For those people who like to study crime and deviance, that's another, kind of area you can go down. So it just depends, right? So today we're going to talk about the family and sociology of the family, and understanding the U.S. family from a sociological lens. So discussion assignment. So you will create a post answering the questions. There are going to be some questions at the end of this PowerPoint. You're going to answer those questions, and you're going to use information from the lectures in your post, right, to respond to these questions, right? So I want to see you using the information. I want to see you. I want to see that you have an understanding. Some of you all have been doing really, really well. Most of you have been doing really well on the discussion posts. So continue to utilize information from the lectures and the readings in your assignments. In your assignments, but in your discussion posts, to let me know that you know how to use this information. In addition, you will respond to another student's post using information from the lecture to support or challenge their ideas. And you're going to respond. You're going to engage in a discussion board post that's entitled Family. So that's the end of the work week this Friday. Don't forget to respond to another student's post. Some of you are not doing that. You're just doing your post and you're forgetting to respond, and you get half credit for that. You get 50%. So, I mean, it's real easy. You get 100, you just, respond. So, make sure you do that. All right. With that being said, let's go into the lecture. So, what is a family? When we are describing the family, what are we talking about? What is a family? And you can pause the lecture here, and you can think about it. Think about a definition of what a family is. What does that look like for you? And not just you, but also what does a family look like for others, right? Because your family may be a traditional family, but then your family may not be, right? But you might still consider what you are in or what you are a part of a family. So what is a family to you? Um, and then uh, we can look here at this slide, and these are two definitions of a family. Okay. One says that according to the US Census, a family is two or more people who are related to each other by birth, marriage, or adoption, and who share living quarters. The United Nations defines it as an act, ceremony, or process by which the legal relationship of a husband or wife is constituted. So, from the very definition that the US Census had at one point and that the United Nations had at one point, from the very definition of family, we already see with our sociological imagination, we already see that there is a bias. There are some biases here. Okay. What are they? What are the biases that you see in these definitions? Some things that are off. Okay. Number one, right? We already see that it says a family is related to each other by birth, marriage, or adoption, and who share living quarters. First off, we don't necessarily, people that we are connected to by birth, marriage, or adoption, we don't always share living quarters with that person, right? I have a cousin that I'm related to by birth, but we don't share living quarters. This says, and you have to share living quarters. So already that's the easy one, right? This could be the legal, right, kind of definition, political definition, if you will. But then there's a social definition, right? Just like we talk about everything is socially constructed, family is socially constructed, meaning what we understand the family to be now is different from what we understood it before. And it's different based on people's circumstances and based on people's social reality. And the fact is that maybe at a certain time, the only people who you were around, especially when families were very big, were family. So it was okay to just consider these people who were biologically your family, or by marriage, or by adoption, your family. But we are so much more intertwined socially now with the schools and after school programs and churches or institutions or other religious institutions and different things that we're a part of, that now it is likely that you may have people in your life that function as biological family members, but may not be. So I want to ask you a question. Can you think of people in your family that if they were not in your family, you probably wouldn't talk to them? Raise your hand. All right. Now, can you think of people that are not biologically, are not related to you by birth, by marriage, or by adoption, but you would consider them family and you would probably risk, let them borrow money or risk your life for them, just like you would if they were a part of your family, even though they're not by this definition? Is there someone that exists like that for you? Right. So family has this political definition according to the US Census, but there's also this social definition that we have as citizens, as humans, where we say, well, that's not necessarily family. That's not just the definition of family. We all have friends or people that maybe we've known for a long time, or people that we know from certain circumstances where we would treat them just like they were our family, if not closer than a lot of the members in our family. People that are friends, but they're like brothers, or people that are friends, but they're like sisters. Maybe just as close to you as your own, if you have siblings, as your own sibling. So there is this socially constructed idea of family that doesn't quite fit into the political description. Also, you got to take into account people's experiences. You got to take race into account. When you take race into account, family's totally different. Because when African people were brought to this country, they were stripped from their families. If you know anything about the history of slavery in the United States, it was highly likely that a mother and a father, or a mother, father, and children could be separated during the enslavement process, where at one point they may be on the same plantation, but then when the child got to a certain age, the children may get sold off to another plantation, maybe even in another state, and sometimes would not ever see their biological mother or father ever again. That was also a reason why many enslaved people ran away, to go find their children, or to go find their mother or their father or their family members. Because family is a very, very important part of the African experience, very part of the African reality. And so because slavery split up families, Black people then, and this has transitioned throughout the generations to now, have had to reconstruct family. During that time, the family was not always biological, but it was whoever you were around at that time. So if there were people on the plantation that were not biologically your family members through birth, marriage, or adoption, but you were in this, you were part of this horrific system and institution together, and you had these shared common experiences of whatever joy you would carve out, as well as the pain of this existence, and you shared it with this person, then this person was like your family because of what you all experienced, because what they were experiencing. All right. And so this is the idea of, within the Black family tradition, of godmothers, godfathers, aunties, uncles, cousins. All of these people can be just as close to you as your actual siblings or your mother or father. Oftentimes because of this tradition of reconstructing family, because in Black America, family has constantly been disrupted by slavery or Jim Crow or mass incarceration. And so Black people have had to redefine what family means to them in order to keep that bond intact. Well, that isn't addressed in this definition, which is why we're looking at it through our sociological imagination. We see that we can't take a political definition and apply it to everybody, because different people are going to be left out and people's experiences are going to be left out. If we go to the United Nations definition, we clearly see that there is a leaving out of a whole group of people. And what people are being left out of this definition? It's clear that the LGBTQ plus population is left out of this definition, because it says that at one point the United Nations defined family as an act between the legal relationship of husband or wife. And so it presents this heteronormative view, foundation of family, which leaves out an entire community. So we already see that there are biases in these definitions, which is why it is important for us to consider and study and examine the sociology of the family. So now let's look at the next slide here. And what we see the 1800s farm family, right? This is an example of an early antebellum US family, right? And if we look at this, what are some things that we see in these pictures? You can pause the video and just look at all of these pictures. What are some similarities that we see in these pictures of the American family, if you will? Well, one thing we see is that they're all white, right? So the early American family was a white family, right? It was a white family. So whiteness was normal. Whiteness was the standard, okay? Also, you see pretty large families. Generally, if someone takes a family picture now of an immediate family or people in one household, you may have 4, 5, right? Traditionally, mother, father, kids, right? But here, there's in one of these pictures is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I don't even know how many people over here. 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the least amount is 7, and you have about 10, and that's probably small or average of people living in one house, of the immediate family of people living in one house. So the early US family was quite large. It's quite large, right? It was not uncommon to have a lot of kids, right? What else do we see? We see that they were white. We see that there are these large families. We see that the father is sitting down as the patriarch. Sometimes the mother is sitting down. Maybe the mother might be standing up. You also see that there are these intergenerational examples of family under one roof. So it looks like there might be some grandmothers in there, some grandfathers, right? They're all on a farm. And another thing that's left out, if we're looking at race and if we're looking at class, and we're talking about class, we're talking about gender, talking about race, the people who are more than likely actually taking care of those children are not in the picture. And those were enslaved people. Many of those people were the ones that actually breastfed the young baby that is sitting on its mother's lap in one of those pictures. Enslaved people were the ones oftentimes that were cooking the meals or taking care of the children, right? Or like I said, doing the breastfeeding, because at that time that was seen as something that was antiquated, archaic, something that animals did, right? Now we understand that breastfeeding is actually a very healthy part of a baby's maturation process. And there's a lot of research that shows that there are, a whole lot of benefits to breastfeeding your child that actually keeps them healthy in the early years of their life. A lot of nutrients in breast milk, right? But again, at this time, it was seen as, uncivilized, right? So these are some of the things we see in this traditional family structure in the middle part of the 19th century. Also, families were not based on a love relationship. Generally, men and women didn't get married for love. There were not these Disney stories, these love stories around family that existed. Families were married, people got married and created families out of convenience. This is the girl I grew up around. She's going to be my wife. He's going to be my husband. And it wasn't really a whole lot. I'm not saying there wasn't any love at all, but it wasn't really a big deal if you didn't love your wife or your husband, because again, in a patriarchal society, the husband was probably sleeping around with other women anyway, right? That wasn't uncommon. So the wife was just a title. that you got out of convenience, but not really out of love. Okay. Another thing, again, these families were controlled by the men, patriarchal family that emerged out of capitalism, individualism, right? And so individual property ownership only went to the men. That means if a man and a woman had children and they only had girls and that man died, that property was going to go to the nearest nephew, right? Or cousin, male cousin, but it had to go to a male. It could not be passed to a woman. So family was a way of controlling property, right? Also, the family, from a class standpoint, the family was put together as this economic engine for an agrarian society. The farm family was the core of what kept the farm running. So it was also a part of this economic engine that was necessary for microeconomics in the United States, which, you know, a collection of these created the overall agrarian society that helped keep the United States afloat during this time before the Industrial Revolution. Okay. So again, it functioned like a little miniature economy. Everybody worked to make food, make clothes. Everybody contributed to the well-being of the family. If you were 5, 6, 7 years old, you're already out working. You're already doing certain things to help make sure that the family is together. Now, we don't think about kids working, right? We don't think about children working. We think about, we don't think about kids working. We don't think about children working. Oftentimes that might not happen until they're older, maybe 13, 14. And then children have to ask, they want to work to make money. All right. But children are really kind of liabilities in a way. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So again, this is what the early family looked like. But with the Industrial Revolution, work started to take on a new form. We've talked about that before. Work became different because now it wasn't just about the family anymore. Now it was about capitalism, making money. Okay. Now it was about making money. Work started to take place out of the home. So in order for you to make money, in order for you to contribute to the family, you had to work in the factories. You had to work in the factories. And so in working in these factories, you had to go away from the farm. Now it was becoming more and more convenient and more lucrative to get one of these 10, 11, 12, 13-hour paying jobs in the factories to work and then bring that money home. But as a result of that, the kind of work that became valuable was not the housework, which was typically related to the woman. And that work was not associated with wage. So that work began to lose value, which means what? The woman's position loses value. Because her position does not directly relate to wages. Children, same thing. Children begin to lose value because their position is not directly related to wage. In fact, their position eats up the wages for a long time until they turn the age that they were allowed to go and work in the factories. So the Industrial Revolution created this division between work and home, and men were associated with the public world of making money, and women were associated with the private world of managing a household and raising children. But at the time, people didn't really see that as much of a job or see that as valuable. And so because of that, it started to create this increase in gender inequality. Created this increase in gender inequality. And so this is when you start to see the family structure change from a sociological standpoint, right? Yes. So this is happening in the middle to the end of the 19th century, right? And now the family structure is beginning to change. Now we're moving into a post-women's suffrage movement where women are now fighting for their right to vote, fighting for their right to education, fighting for their right to work, wages being equal, which is something women are still fighting for to this day. And you start to see this change, especially around the 1920s, where you have this flapper movement, you have this sexual revolution that is occurring where people are starting to want to break away from the traditional ways of family or the traditional gender roles, right? This is starting to occur in the early 20th century of America's existence, and then moves us into the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, things start to change, right? Now everybody's trying to survive. So we're not really tripping off gender roles right now. Whoever can work, whoever can get money, whoever can keep this family with bread and shelter and water, that's who needs to do whatever needs to be done. So in those times where survival, in times of survival mode, this idea of inequality is, we're not tripping off of that. Inequality typically comes about when people are thriving and they want to remain in power. So shortly after the Great Depression is when you have obviously World War II, which is the event that helped to get the United States out of the Great Depression because it put Americans to work, right? But a lot of men were fighting in the war, which meant we needed somebody to make the bullets, make the guns, make the, work in the factories to make the weapons and the outfits, the soldier, material, things that they would wear, artillery, everything, right? We need somebody to make all this stuff. So women went to work. Okay, so now women are working, men are at war, the country's kind of coming back around again. And when we come back, and now this moves us into the 1950s, we see we start to see a much more thriving US. This is the golden years, what has often been called the golden years of American history. Your Dennis the Menace, Leave It to Beaver era, right? I know some of y'all may not be familiar with this, but this era, right, of American history was when you had the mother, the father, the child or children, not as many children as in the 19th century, right? The mother oftentimes stayed home, right? The father oftentimes went to work. And it was this era, it was this time period that we see gender roles starting to come back around and to be cemented like it was in the 19th century, right? However, this was, again, you're talking post-women's suffrage, you're talking on the heels of the civil rights movement, and this is a time where people's consciousness are being raised. Wait a minute, now women, Black people, people that are marginalized are now speaking up. I don't know if I like this. I don't know if women say, I don't know if I just want to be relegated to the house. I don't know if I just want to be a housewife. A lot of these women went to college. You now have women's colleges, Smith College and other colleges during this time. Women are saying, I have a whole degree. And I'm in front of a stove cooking pies and cakes. Nah, I don't think I want to do this. I want to use my brain. What happens if this man dies? I don't have a way of making money. I don't have work experience. What am I going to do? Also, and we've talked about this before, men often abuse women sexually, physically, emotionally. Women, there's another class that I teach where we talk about this in way more detail. There's a movie called Revolutionary Road with Leonardo DiCaprio and I think Kate Winslet. You got to watch that. And it goes into the psyche of the 1950s American housewife. And just kind of spoiler alert, but Kate Winslet pretty much like goes crazy from just being relegated to this house. It's a very, very good film that deals with what these women were really going through during that time. So yeah, check it out. But this is showing that these gender roles that were established in the 19th century could not stand up in the mid 20th century consciousness of the US people. And so what you start to see in the 1950s is women are starting to resist. This is again coming while the civil rights movement. So you're seeing Black people resisting racism and inequality by marching and protesting. And now women are saying, we need to jump on board this. Now you see the second wave of feminism happening. Now you see Betty Friedan's work. Now you're seeing the women burning their bras movement, right? Now you see all of these movements that would eventually lead to the creation of Roe v. Wade in the 1970s, but you're seeing women protest. You're also seeing this sexual revolution where now people are becoming more open with their sexual fluidity. Now it's not just about men with women, women with men. Women are experimenting with women. Men are experimenting with men. Some of these are not experiments, but people are actually living out loud a non-heterosexual identity. Now you talk about the 1960s. This is a whole new era. Rock and roll, R&B, Black power, militancy, jazz, Woodstock, sexual revolution. Like this is, and you know who's going crazy over this stuff? Traditional white men. They're like, what is happening to this country? Everybody's out of place. Women are out of their place. Black people out of their place. Gay people are out of their place. What is going on? Everybody's looking to be free, looking to be liberated, wanting to live out loud and live the way that they were meant to be able to live. And want to have a place in this democracy. And so now this leads us to the next slide. I know that was long, but now it leads us to this next slide of the marriage movement. Because after the civil rights movement, after the 1960s and going into the 1970s, and again, if you watch documentaries or shows, or if you're a historian like I am, and you just watch this stuff for fun, you start to see that politically traditional white men are saying, we got to get our country back in order. People are now moving away from, traditional man-woman marriages, or now people are talking it's more kind of now than it was then, but now people are discussing poly relationships and all these different things. And these traditional white men are saying, no, we can't have this. So what you have in the 1970s and in the 1980s is this marriage movement, right? That fought against the sexual revolution of the 50s and the 60s, fought against the teen pregnancy that was becoming more common in the 60s and in the 70s, and even in the 50s. A lot of people don't talk about it. Teen pregnancy was a thing in the 50s. And of course, the same-sex marriage. Gay people talking about getting married? No, you're crazy. So traditional marriage is now going against this, right? And so this is when you have organizations like James Dobson focused on the family, David Pepino's work with the National Marriage Project, to now they're dumping billions of dollars into these projects. Focus on the Family is still big to this day. Billions of dollars into these Christian networks, Trinity Broadcast, TBN, and Trinity Broadcast Network, and all these different groups. This is when you see the rise of the evangelical Christian. This is when you see the rise. And this is where you see conservatives are now pushing back and gaining more power politically. And one of the first things they do is they start to push traditional marriage. Men and women getting married, pushing traditional roles. You start to see those expand in the 1980s as well. With Reaganomics, although the 80s is kind of seen as this, again, this rebellious era, there was this era where it was about church, traditional families, traditional standards. That was a response to the protests of the 60s and the 70s, right? And so that is what we start to see in this marriage movement of the 70s and 80s. But it didn't come without a counter narrative, again, of a much more diverse family. So now we're moving towards the end of the 20th century. Families are much more diverse now, right? You have endogamy versus exogamy. Endogamy refers to marriage or marrying someone inside of your social group, marrying someone who is in your race, in your class, in your religion, in your, nationality, in your region. All right, and that was very popular for a long time. But as we move towards the 20th century, exogamy is becoming much more popular. Now people are starting to marry interracially. People are starting to marry outside of their class group, outside of their religions. Christians and Muslims getting married, oh my goodness. Muslims and Buddhists getting married, oh my goodness. But this is exogamy. This is when you marry somebody outside of your social group. And when we talk about endogamy versus exogamy, while it is becoming more common to see more interracial relationships or more interclass relationships, and these interracial relationships are happening largely because of Loving versus Virginia. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Loving versus Virginia case, but Loving versus Virginia was a case in the 1960s. I think it started actually in the 50s, but the case was actually settled in the 60s, where this white man and this Black woman wanted to get married in Virginia. That's where their home was. That's where their land was, their family. But because of their race, they could not. So they had to go to Maryland to get married. But they didn't want to stay in Maryland because all of their family were in Virginia. And so they fought the state of Virginia and lost on the state level, the regional level, and they took it all the way to the Supreme Court to challenge anti-miscegenation laws, which said that interracial marriage was not lawful in the United States. And they challenged that, and the court at that time favored the Loving family. Their family was called the Loving family, and it favored the Loving family, and they were able to get married, legally. So this is helping to advance the cause of exogamy, where now people are marrying outside of their social groups. It's still not as common as we think it is, though. People tend to still marry within their social groups, particularly within their racial groups. The people that have the highest percentage of marrying inside of their social group are white people. White people marry inside their social group more than any other race. And the people that marry outside their racial group more than any other race are Asian women, Asian American women. They're more likely to marry outside of their race than any other group, right? African Americans marry inside their race more than any other minority group, and African American women specifically marry inside their race more than any other racial group, right? So
while the interracial marriage is climbing, it's still not as common, but the overall U.S. family is becoming more diverse from from the idea of being acceptably diverse, because it was always diverse. Now, if we want to really talk about it, this gets a little dark, but the raping of enslaved women during slavery was extremely common. Extremely common. So there was diversity for sure, because there's a lot of mixed race children, right? That either identified as white or identified as black early on. In fact, I believe it was LaRon Bennett Jr. I can't remember. Oh, goodness, I got so many books in my head. But one of those books talks about how a majority of the African-American population has some form of whiteness in them, right? You're talking 90%, right? Even ones that may look like me, don't look biracial, are not biracial from the immediate family, but if we go back far enough, the likelihood of there being some white person in the family is like 80 to 90%. So it's diversity for sure. Just that wasn't acceptable. Now when we talk about diversity, we're talking about, non-forceful, non-rape, consensual diversity in the family. So, what are we talking about? Okay, so again, because of, and I don't know if we really get into it with this class, but I know particularly in my race class, we talk about white habitus, the theory of white habitus, and how segregation creates a level of endogamy that is very much higher than exogamy, because, and a lot of the reasons why there's so little diversity in the US families is because of overall political social segregation. White people are more likely to go to schools with predominantly white students. White people are more likely to live in neighborhoods that are predominantly white. Black people, Latinx people are more likely to live in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black or Latinx, or go to schools that are predominantly Black. And even if one goes to a school that is diverse, it's likely that they will come home or go to churches or be a part of social institutions that more so reflect their culture, right? And this comes from political and social de facto segregation, as well as de jure segregation, right? It comes from the segregation that happens within society, as well as the separation that we ourselves present when we say, I kind of want to sit at the Black kids table because I'm Black, or the white kids table because I'm white, right? Or the Asian kids table in the cafeteria because I'm Asian. This leads to a book written by Beverly Tatum, former president of Spelman College, and a psychologist who wrote a book called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria, and early conversations around race, right? So this is about the kind of de facto and de jure segregation that creates larger levels of endogamy over exogamy, right? Okay, so, now, last part of this diversity in families, talk about is monogamy versus polygamy. So monogamy is the practice of marrying or being in a relationship with one person at a time, but in polygamy, you have a system of marriage that allows people to have more than one spouse. And obviously there are different forms of polygamy. You have polygamy, where men have multiple wives, or polyandry, where women have multiple husbands, which is much, much more rare. And then you have polyamory, where you have consensually non-monogamous relationships in a lot of different ways. And I don't know if I listen to a lot of podcasts. And so there are these sex podcasts or family podcasts that discuss, or relationship podcasts that talk about all these different forms of polygamy. And it's like a lot of them, right? But these are becoming more popular now, right? And for sure, post-civil rights, post-sexual revolution, it's becoming more popular where people are saying, no, I don't just want to be with one person at a time, So really redefining, going back to what we were talking about earlier, really redefining what it means to live in, or to live in or be a part of the American US family,
right? So the current research on family, so now we're coming to where we are now, and the current research on family is quite interesting. What we're seeing is that non-marital childbearing focuses or is largely the result of social class more than race. So a lot of research on children born out of wedlock has started to focus less on race and more on class. There was a time, particularly in the 1970s, 80s, where people were studying non-marital childbearing, women who were having children out of wedlock, and they were saying, particularly Black people, right? Like these single Black mothers and the welfare mothers, and we talked about that with the Black feminist thought, right? Collins' work, and it was kind of sent to race, right? It was because of race, and Black people were more likely to have children out of wedlock and be single mothers and that sort of thing, which was the reason why there were all of these policies and regulations around welfare and who would receive government assistance. But the more current research is showing that, well, it's not really about race. Actually, poor people or working class people are more likely than middle class people or upper middle class people to have children outside of wedlock. It's not really about race as much as it's just about class, right? And so what we start to see then is even poor white people are having children outside of wedlock, right? And the reason why it's a class thing more so than a race thing is because oftentimes poor people, and there's a much larger lecture that I have from another book that goes into much more detail. Poor people actually want to get, people in general, a lot of people still believe in a traditional marriage and want to get married. Poor people want to get married, but there's so many benefits if you are poor and a single mother that you receive more so than if you have a partner, if you have a husband, if you have a man in the home. The support that you receive from your family, the support that you receive from the government decreases dramatically. And so oftentimes to strategize and to navigate the system, a man and a woman, even though they love each other and they want to be married, but they're poor, will decide not to, but they will still raise the children together so that that woman can receive benefits because the man, for whatever reason, because that would be much more economically beneficial for the child. Some people may say, well, why don't the man just get a job? And then when he gets a job, there could be a lot of different reasons why that may occur. He may have been to prison. He may be in prison or have been to prison, got out. It's hard to find a job. He may be handicapped or differently abled. That's another way of saying it, differently abled. There could be mental issues. There's so many different reasons why people are in poverty, usually not because, and we've talked about that, usually not because they don't want to work or aren't working hard. In fact, poor and working class people oftentimes work way harder than middle and upper middle class people. I often tell my story of when I did not have as much means. I for sure worked way more hours and worked way harder than when I became a person with means. So it's the benefits of class allows for people to have access to more ways in which to make money and not have to work as hard, right? So it's important that we understand, right, not to criminalize or set deviance on people because of their social class, and oftentimes not assign meaning, marital meaning, love meaning to these people when many of them are just trying to navigate a system that actually seems to reinforce a discord in family as opposed to more cohesive American family, even though the country says that it is a country that is pro-family, but the policies aren't really set up that way. So then when we talk about class and childbearing, if you go to Annette LaRoe's work, Unequal Childhood, she talks about how class, not childbearing, child rearing, class largely affects how children are raised, right? Concerted cultivation for the middle class, right, says that middle class parents are more likely to place their children in organizations, groups, classes, chess, robotics, tutoring, math, basketball, well, maybe not basketball, but maybe like tennis or something like that, where there's this concerted cultivation of skills, talents. Wherein for lower class people, their child rearing is more so from natural growth. Meaning if you come from a lower class, when you get out of school, you're not going to chess club. You're not going to robotics club. You're probably going home, riding the bus, going home, and going outside to play. And that's where you learn life skills. That's where you're learning some of the similar things that middle class people are learning in this concerted cultivating space. Lower class people are learning in the streets, in the neighborhoods, on sidewalks. This is where they're beginning to make sense of their reality, learning conflict resolution skills. But it may not be in the same way as it is from the kid, the middle class kid who goes to robotics after school. This kid who's learning out in the neighborhood, in the streets, on the playgrounds, going to play basketball after school or whatever, may learn conflict resolution, not just necessarily through fighting. Some people may say, oh, ghetto hood kids or whatever fighting, but sometimes you learn how not to fight. If you listen to a lot of comedians, they say many of them either were tired of fighting, didn't want to fight, and so they use comedy to lower the conflict in a particular place of space, right? Some people did or learn to use violence in natural growth. Some people learn other ways. If you read Will Smith's book, he talks about the use of entertainment and comedy. His sister was a flight type of person. She learned to run, right? Some people, it used to be called playing the dozens. Early Florida, we used to call it ranking. Now they call it joning. So instead of fighting with this, you fight with your words, right? You learn how to pick on people. Yo mama this, yo mama that, right? These things oftentimes you learn from natural growth. Concerted cultivation from middle class and upper middle class people, not so much. And this is across racial groups. So it's not just black or white, right? Again, this is based off of Annette LaRoe's work, Unequal Childhoods. Then you also have this notion of the second shift. We talked about this, I believe, in the gender class. We talked about the second shift and how women oftentimes have this second shift of when they get off work, they come home and they have a second shift of taking care of the home, et cetera, et cetera. Men, oftentimes, they get home, they get to crack open a beer, watch the game, relax, right, after work, right? Also, current research on family, divorce and separation says that laws make it easier now for women to divorce. And women are more likely to file for divorce than men. There's a whole lot more we can say, but we're not going to go too deep into that. But if I were to teach a sociology of the family class, we could definitely go into that. But marriage no longer became a necessity for women's survival. The more that women were able to have access to education and opportunities and resources, the less likely they were going to stay in a marriage that did not serve them. The less likely that they will put up with abuse. The less likely that they will put up with mistreatment or infidelity. So now women are saying, well, I have a master's degree. I have job and work experience. I don't have to put up with things that I had to put up with, that my mother had to put up with, or my grandmother, because now I can function on my own. So women, but still, so even though women have more opportunities now, which leads to which kind of have some relationship to the divorce rate and separation rate, women are still more likely to be in a worse economic situation after divorce because society is still set up for men to be much more economically stable than women. And men benefit much more financially in a marriage, in a traditional marriage, than women do. But it also goes back to the idea that now, unlike what we talked about earlier in the class, now satisfaction is way more important. It's not just about convenience. People generally are not marrying for convenience anymore or out of survival or necessity. Now people are saying men have access to opportunities. Women have access to opportunities, in general. And so now it's like, well, if I'm gonna be married to you, I want to be married because I want to be with you, because I like you, because I love you, because I want to be here, not because I have to be here, right? And again, we're generalizing, right? There are obviously situations where people do still stay together out of necessity or because they have a good life or whatever, But yeah, so a lot of the current research is looking at these topics. Okay, so let's jump to a quick activity. I kind of have to kind of say it as opposed to that you actually doing it in class, because really this lecture takes place over about 2 days, but we're just going to cover it all today. And you can watch it, when you have time, and stop it here and come back or whatever. But there's this activity that I often do called life-mate activity, and you can participate in this right now. You don't have to turn it in or anything, but just something to consider. What I would ask you to do is take out a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, and I want you to write down the characteristics of a person you would want to marry. Right? If you marry or have a lifelong partnership. Everybody doesn't necessarily want to be married, but have a lifelong partnership. And I want you to write down the characteristics of that person. And write down the characteristics of how they would look, their personality, their values, their social status, their education level, all of those things. As much as you can think of, I want you to write down those characteristics. You could pause it here, do that, then come back. All right, now I want you to put a check mark to all of the qualities on the paper that's in front of you that describes you. So put a check mark by all those qualities. Now, raise your hand if half of the qualities you want in a mate you also see in yourself. If you have 15 or 16 qualities in a mate, raise your hand if you have 8 or more check marks, or if you have 10, 5 or more check marks. And every single time I do this assignment in class, a majority of the class has their hand raised. Why do you think a majority of the class has their hand raised? The reason why is because, in general, people like themselves. So in general, people want to be with someone that's similar to them. Now, of course, they have the thing opposites attract and all these different things. And, I guess to some degree it may be true, but be careful with that. But in general, people want to marry somebody like them or be in a partnership with somebody like them. Because many people are comfortable with themselves and comfortable with what they see in the mirror. Again, in general. And so you want someone very similar to you, maybe a little bit different. But what this goes to show is that who we are, and we've already shown this in throughout this sociology course, who we are is largely based on societal standards, societal separation, traditional norms, whether good, bad, or indifferent. And so because of these things, it is now reflected in the people who we choose to date. And the people who we choose to date are largely political because our lives are political. And the people we date are political. And we choose people to marry or be in lifelong partnerships with out of who? The people that we date, which are what? Political. And the people who we marry or in lifelong partnerships with are the people who we have what with? Families. So families are chosen largely off of political reasons of the people we're around, the people we see, the people we want to be around, our beliefs, our philosophies, our religion, the way we were raised, the way we think, the way our family raised us. Those things are based off of politics. Those things are based off of social constructions. That's what we've been talking about this whole time. Okay. So sociologically speaking, the person that you choose will be somebody who is very much like you. And social forces influence us more than we think they do. Now, let's talk about the NBA draft, right? This is another thing that I talk about. Who knows how the NBA draft works? Can anybody tell me? Anybody know? If you know, you can just say it. Or NBA draft works like this, right? You have college basketball, and then you have the NBA. And in college basketball, you have the top scouts or you have the top players. And those top players oftentimes are getting ready to get drafted to the NBA. And the NBA sets it up so that the team with the worst record of that year, that previous year, gets the opportunity to get the best pick from the college scouts, from the college players. So when Cleveland got LeBron James that year, Cleveland was able to get LeBron James because in 2003, because they had the worst schedule. And sometimes teams will throw away a year, lose, purposely lose, not really try to, win a lot so that they can have that first pick. But some people may say, well, that's not fair. The teams that are good are good. Shouldn't they be rewarded for being good by being able to get a good player? Also, the teams that are good are selling tickets, they're selling merchandise, they're getting money. They have the money to pay these college players to a lot of money to come to their team. Why are they not being rewarded for being good? Why does the worst team get the best player? Can anybody tell me, or is that fair? Some people may say, well, no, that's not fair. But a lot of people understand. Why does the NBA do that? The NBA does that because if the best teams got the best college players all the time, who would win? The same teams will win over and over and over and over and over again. I was just watching a documentary. I always watch documentaries but I like sports documentaries. I like sports. And I was watching it on the Lakers and the Celtics in the 1980s. And they were literally, with the exception of like Detroit sometimes and Philly sometimes, the Lakers with Magic Johnson, the Celtics with Larry Bird were like the best teams in the 80s. Now imagine if, and they were great, right? But imagine if the Lakers had Magic and Kareem and all these different people, and the Celtics had Bird and and all these great players. And then when they retired, the Lakers got Michael Jordan, and Boston was able to get Isaiah Thomas, and the Lakers got Dennis Rodman, and Boston was able to get Patrick Ewing, and all these great players in the 90s. And then when they retired, the Lakers got Kobe Bryant. And Boston, the Lakers did get Kobe Bryant, but the Lakers got Kobe Bryant, but Boston got LeBron James. And the Lakers, did get Shaq. and Boston got, Carmelo Anthony or something like that. literally from the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, it'll be the same people getting these great players. But that's not going to sell no tickets and nobody's going to watch it. The reason why we watch games is because we want to see the opportunity for the underdog to win. And we want to see how good the champion is by saying, okay, even within this balance of not getting the best players, can you still do what you're doing? And the fact remains is this is why you have dynasties. So the Lakers and the Celtics were the dynasties in the 80s, but the dynasty in the 90s was the Chicago Bulls, and then later on kind of San Antonio. And then in the 2000s, you had the Lakers and you had San Antonio and you had Detroit. And in the 2010s, you have Cleveland, you have, Cleveland only won one, but you had Golden State mainly. Golden State and Miami, I think, won a couple, right? So you have all of these different dynasties and you don't know who's going to win. And then sometimes you might have another team that might come out and win. I think Milwaukee or Toronto, and other people who like may come out. Well, Milwaukee did win, but last year. But now the playing field is a little bit more even. Because now other people have a chance to be great and other people have a chance to be successful. And most of you may say, well, yeah, that makes sense. Sell more tickets, more jerseys. People are more excited about going to the games. They're more excited about their teams. It makes sense. What if society worked that way? What if society worked where the generation that was on top did not have access to the best schools in the next generation? Didn't have access to the best institutions, the best opportunities. Still were able to be successful, but not as successful because they did not have access. What made the Lakers or the Celtics or Chicago so great was because they kept a dynasty over a period of time where even though they weren't getting the best players, they were still winning. That's what made them great. If they were always getting the best players out of college, it's too easy. You have to prove your success despite equality, but that's not how our society works. Our society does not allow you to prove your greatness in spite of inequality. In spite of equality, your greatness is defined by the fact that there is inequality. So typically, if you come from an upper middle class home, and you get the opportunity to go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, and you graduate, and you get this wonderful job with all this money, and you have all these resources, and you marry somebody else with all these resources, and you have kids, and then they come from an upper middle class home, and they have all these resources and private tutors and this and that, and all this experience and culture and and then they grow up. Where are they going to go to school? They're going to go to school at a Harvard, Yale, Princeton, whatever. Some of the top was considered to be the top schools. And then it's just going to go over and over and start a business and make a lot of money and have all these opportunities and and then they're going to do it. And then they're going to have kids and they're going to do it again and again and again and again and again. But what if that spot for that one generation, now that next spot in opportunities in a big school or opportunities to work at a big company or start a business did not go to that upper middle class family, but now it came from the lower class family or the working class family or a poor family or a lower middle class family. And now they have the opportunity and we balance it. But then maybe the next generation might go back to that one that missed the opportunity the next generation, but they got the next generation. So now it's kind of more balanced like the NBA. What if society was like that? Wouldn't that be more balanced? Wouldn't it give more opportunities to people? And then a person can prove their greatness because despite the fact that this next generation didn't have access to that spot at Yale or at Princeton or a spot at an internship in this big company or a spot at this or a spot at that, despite that, if they were still able to be successful and get rich and make millions and millions of dollars or come up with an idea, now you're great. Now you are successful. Now you've proven that you're really a genius. You know who talks about that is actually Warren Buffett. he talks about the fact that his wealth, while he did have to be smart and understand the economy and stock and finances, he said he read every book in the library on the topic. He said, "My man, I was privileged. Came from an upper middle class family. My dad knew stocks. I learned from him." And then I just kind of took it and ran with it, but he was already successful in it. I was white in the Depression, and we still had money, right? So he came from privilege. Not to say, not to take anything away from his success, he didn't come from billions of dollars that he has now, but he was still. So if society functioned more like the NBA draft, would it be more balanced? And would it really prove the innovativeness of a person and the genius and the brilliance of a person to be successful despite equality, not because of inequality? Something to think about. Okay. All right, we're gonna run through these. Shouldn't take us long. And that will be it for this lecture. So, marriage dearth. Marriage dearth is a concept that we use to talk about people who are less likely to be living in matrimony than half a century ago. So basically just talks about the decline in the marriage rates and the marital rates. So there are 4 categories that we typically see. The marital status is never married, married, widowed, or divorced. And the percentage of people who are divorced have almost tripled. And the percentage of people who are never married has almost doubled, right? So we're starting to see a marriage dearth. We're starting to see the fact that people are less likely to be married now than 50 years ago. And what are some of these examples? Now, a lot of this depends on age. Some people, relate this to race, and there's a lot of statistics around, particularly Black women. Black women aren't as likely to get married as white women, and da 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 da. But when we control for age, we start to realize, well, that's not necessarily the case. White women are likely to get married earlier, 21, 22, 23. Black women are not getting married as early as white women, but Black women, but when you start to look at maybe 28, 32, 35, you start to see that those rates are similar to white women who are getting married at an earlier age, right? But there is this people that are less likely to get married. And why do you think people are less likely to get married now than 50 years ago? And I don't have a whole lot of research on it, just curious. Just something to think about. Right? Something to think about. Some people say that the marriage dearth can be because of the supply factors. There's a pool of the supply factors we talk about are the pool of eligible prospects. So the supply of potential marriageable partners in some communities have decreased. And this could be for many reasons, but from a sociological standpoint and looking at it politically, we realize that a lot of it is because of things like mass incarceration. So if you look at the Black community specifically, or the Latinx community specifically, when a larger number of the men are taken away and placed in an institution for 10, 15, 20 years, that decreases the supply of potential marriageable partners for these women, right? Which has led to a marriage dearth within the Black community specifically. Right. And there's a lot of research that talks about that specifically. And I want to say the new Jim Crow talks about that. Michelle Alexander, former lawyer and journalist. Right. One of the best books awards, one of the best books written in 2010s. Right. And so there are these socio-political reasons as to why a marriage dearth can't happen. But then there are other ones that maybe other examples or explanations you might have. Also, marriage dearth can be because of individuals who identify with a religion tend to form traditional marriages. So if you were raised Christian, or if you were raised Muslim, or within the Judeo-Christian tradition, then you're more likely to believe in traditional marriage, right? Approximately 51% of all US adults do not adhere to a particular faith tradition. So more and more US people are saying, well, I don't know if I identify fully with Christianity or fully with Islam. And so this is showing that, or that could be one of the reasons why there's a marriage dearth. Why less and less people are wanting to be married, because less and less people are adhering to a specific, particularly Judeo-Christian faith tradition. Research also shows that there's a correlation between spirituality and resilience and the ability to bounce back from change or troubles. So sometimes if you are a part of a faith tradition or a spiritual idea, then when people who are married go through hardships, or when marriages may go through separation or even divorce, there is this bounce back that occurs if you adhere to a specific faith or faith tradition, right? There's also evidence that shows that economic hardships, there's a relationship between economic hardships and marital stability. The more people suffer economically, the more likely it is that divorce or separation can become evident, right? So social class can shape the quality of conjugal and parent-child relationships. When we look at some divorce rates within the not the Great Depression, but within the recession of 2008, as in states where the rise of home foreclosures rose, you also saw rose in divorce rates. So when people start struggling financially, some people might start looking at each other like, I think it's your fault, it's your fault. It brings out the negative in some people, and it could lead to divorce, right? So there are these social and economic factors around divorce and separation. Families appear to have fewer problems and fare better in societies that value and make families a priority. So those countries that invest in families, that put money in family organizations and family traditions, and invest a lot of time and effort into building their country's families, they tend to have fewer problems. But the US actually invests less in government programs for family than any other developed nation in the world. And some of this is the product of the belief that family is an individual responsibility. It's an individual responsibility. It's not up to the government to decide what you do with your family. Remember, the United States is a country built off of individualism. So we don't want to get involved, or want to be as less involved as possible in people's individual lives. But the less likely you are involved, or government is involved in the family, the more problems you're going to have. So should the family be a private institution, or should the family be more of a public institution? This is actually a question that you're going to see later. So keep this in mind. This is a question you're going to see later. So also, there are benefits to being married, though. Marriage equals money. There are some economic benefits to being married versus like cohabitation or being divorced or never being married. Some of the economic benefits: one, two people live a whole lot. Two can live more cheaply than one. If you got two incomes coming in the home, you got access to more money. Way more you can do with two than one. Married couples save and invest more in their future. You can if it's more than one person. Especially if you can live off one person and then save and invest the other person's income. Oh my goodness. Very well off. One person acts as insurance. If it's just you, you get sick or unemployed, that's it. If you're married, you get sick or unemployed, you can depend on your partner. More employment-based benefits, better tax loopholes, right? Or tax write-offs for married people. Married men tend to live longer and healthier lives. Actually, health research shows married men live longer and healthier than single men. And married women do not live as long as single women. So that goes to show marriage may be beneficial for men, may not be as beneficial for women. Why? Maybe because of the stress of those gender roles. Something to consider, right? Best marital household is the one where the wife is working. When wives are able to work, you see the marital households thriving, right? Then there's this notion of the marriage squeeze. The marriage squeeze says that the imbalanced sex ratio experienced by black women is contributed to these factors like death, imprisonment, military enlistment for black men. Black men die at an earlier age than in general white men. Black men are incarcerated way more than white men. And this being enlisted into the military oftentimes happens more for black men than white men. There are higher rates of unemployment for black men. And so oftentimes black women don't want to marry him because they ain't got no job. How you gonna take care of me and a check? Black men are more likely than black women to marry someone of another race, right? That is also part of the marriage squeeze. Now, black men are more likely than any other minority race of men to marry inside their race, meaning black men marry inside their race more than Latino men, more than Asian men, more than Native American men. But in comparison to black women, black men marry inside their race less. But it's only by like 4 or 5 points, I think. It's like 92% versus like 87 or 88, right? But if you look at these factors on blackdemographics.com, you kind of see some of more of the social economic factors. Also, current research on family says that attitudes towards marriage are changing, right? Among the never married, 61% say they wish to be married. 27% say they don't wish to be married. And 12% are still unsure. So a lot of people still want to be married. But in 2011, almost 4 in 10 Americans said they felt marriage was becoming obsolete. That's almost half. And that was 2011. So a lot of people want to be married, but this idea of marriage being something that's kind of in the past is growing. It's growing. So something to think about. Right? Divorce in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was like this stigma attached to divorce. You know, it kept the divorce rates very low. If you got divorced in like the 1900s, it was like, you're damaged goods. It was very restrictive laws. Usually you could only do it if you could prove that a person was being abused, that your husband cheated, or that the husband abandoned you. All right. But now, and there were very limited opportunities for women. But now, again, like we talked about earlier, opportunities for women have allowed them to leave marriages if they choose. And the incidence of divorces have fallen in the 21st century. So actually, divorce rates were actually higher, I want to say, in like the 80s and 90s than they are now. I'm actually going down a little bit. Right? They've actually gone down a little bit. Also, cohabitation. The number of married, unmarried partner households more than doubled in the last 20 years. So more people are looking at the idea of cohabitating, and a lot of the majority of adults are saying that they cohabitated at some point before they got married. More people are saying, I want to see what I'm gonna get into before I decide to give my life to you, right? Now, at one point, cohabitating before marriage was a complete no-no, usually because they didn't, under these very traditional ideas, a lot of people did not believe in having sex before marriage, right? But now more people are saying, nah, we need to do this. And compared to non-cohabitators, unmarried partners were more likely to be younger, to have lower levels of education and income. They were less religious. They probably came from divorced parents, or maybe they were divorced. They lived without a father in the home, or had higher levels of marital conflict than growing up. So these people were kind of more likely to decide, well, I want to be cohabitators or maybe be partnered, but not married. So these people tended to have probably a much more cynical view of marriage than people outside of these groups. And the last thing about marriage is that the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, which was passed in, which was passed in 1996 by Bill Clinton, defined marriage as the legal union of one man and one woman for federal and interstate purposes. And this was the bill, or this was the act that solidified and put a halt on the same-sex marriage push in the 90s and in the 2000s. But now, as of June 26, 2016, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage was legal in the United States, but it's still being debated on the local and the state levels, and in some places the national levels. But definitely on the local and state levels, it still is not, in many states, still not seen as legal. So this is showing that the family is changing. The family is growing. The way in which we understand the family and family dynamics are constant. This is why socially constructed. It changes, it grows, it gets defined and redefined over time, right? Over time. So discussion post, talked about it earlier. This is what you're going to respond to. Is the family a public or private institution? If the family is a public institution, then the community has a responsibility and right to step inside the family to ensure the safety and well-being of the children. But if the family is a private institution, then the family has the right to and responsibility to raise children according to their own values. I want you to explain in detail which one you think it is. Using information from the lecture and or reading, I want you to support your position. And I want you to provide examples or scenarios as to why you feel one way or another. Okay. And remember to follow the instructions for how to do a discussion post. All right, with that being said, thank you for listening. Hope you gained something from this lecture. Hope you are listening and reading and following along with the PowerPoints. I'm enjoying the conversations or the discussions that I'm having with students about these topics. And look forward to more. So have a great day, great week, great weekend. See you soon.